안녕하세요, 톰의 인사 부탁드립니다.
반갑습니다. 와인마시는아톰 이준혁입니다.
자, 오늘 주제는 뭘까요?
오늘은 제가 가장 애정하는 생산자 중 한 명인 알렉스 모로 형님을 모시고 인터뷰를 좀 진행을 해볼까 합니다. 알렉스 모로 같은 경우에는 제가 뉴욕에 있을 때 2016년에 처음 테스팅을 했었는데 그때부터 굉장히 좋아하는 화이트 와인이었습니다. EMP에서 그때 뉴욕의 탑 소믈리에들이 한 열 몇 명이 모여서 슈발리에 몽라셰를 블라인드 테스팅을 했었는데 그때 1등을 해서 저도 깜짝 놀라서 두 분의보다 맛있었어요. 그래서 그때부터 푹 빠지게 됐습니다. Hi Alex. Okay. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. Thank you, Jun. I'm Alex Moreau, yes, from Alex Moreau Wines, ex-Bernard Moreau Wines. I'm born, grew up, and live in Chassagne-Montrachet, Burgundy. I've been making the wine for now 30 years at the family domain.
This is first visit to Korea. What were your first impression?
Well, yes, correct. My first visit in Korea, in this part of Asia. I like to discover the country and the food.
Okay.
And since 24 hours, we have discovered many foods with you, and thank you for that. And it's always interesting for us. Food is important because with our wine, it's all about drink and eat.
Could you briefly introduce your winery?
Today, Alex Moreau domain is established on 7 hectares. We had an evolution on the domain. I'm the fourth generation, but my grandfather, Marcel Moreau, did a large part of the work we have the luck to work with today. Means bought the land and build a winery. So before the wine was sold under the name Marcel Moreau, then it was under my father's name, Bernard, since 1977. And this period, my dad changed a few things compared to my grandfather's wine. You know, you have to keep in mind, in the past, my grandfather made his own wine under his own label, but at that period, it was a part of the sale was in barrel to the big negotiations in Beaune. In the past, it was only 4 wines made under Marcel Moreau wine. First wine was a Chassagne-Montrachet. And in the Chassagne-Montrachet, it was including Premier Cru, Maltroit, Morgeau, Chenevotte, Changuin. Everything was blended into the Chassagne village. Yes. And my grandfather kept separately only Les Grandes Ruchottes on his own.
Okay.
And under my father's name, first vintage, 1982, he decided to keep separately vineyards like Chenevotte, Maltroit, Morgeau. And me, my generation, the vintage 1995. In the past, my dad, the Premier Cru Changuin, he blended to the village as well. Okay. And me, I said, can we keep this one separately as well? Because it's a small production, only 2 barrels. So we do like that. So it looks like each generation has got his little influence. Okay. So the domain, so Bernard Moreau became Bernard Moreau et Fils. And then finally, over 25 years, I decided to put my name on the label. It became Alex Moreau now since the vintage 2021. For people who follow the domain since the beginning, they can see a tiny evolution of the label. But pretty much each generation has got his little impact. But for sure, a visual comment from 3 generations.
Can you try to wine a little bit?
Sure. Of course. Wine is made to be shared. Merci.
Could you explain about the 2023 vintage?
Yeah. 2023. It just arrived on the market, actually. 23 was again, I think we are going to speak this a bit later, but challenging vintage. not because of a disease or this kind of thing, just because of the heat. It was a warm vintage. It was warm, but the good thing of this vintage 23, it was quite generous crop. So we need that sun to get all the grapes mature. And so we start to pick this vintage early September. And I think 23, they show the terroir, they show the freshness. Freshness is important word for my philosophy of wine. Okay, we are in Chassagne-Montrachet. We are clearly identified as a Chassagne-Montrachet producer, but we pay attention on the Bourgogne because it's like a introduction to our domain. Of course, Chassagne-Montrachet, it's Bourgogne, the vineyard is all located on Chassagne-Montrachet, but it is not a declassified Chassagne-Montrachet. It's just growing in the Bourgogne district, but still on Chassagne. So we can say it's a petit Chassagne.
And trouble.
Merci.
It's very acidic driven and very fresh. And
when you taste the wine, you don't feel it's a warm vintage.
Not like 2003 or 2023 is very hot year during like August maybe.
We had 3 waves of heat in 23. The first one came in June. It was okay. The good weather during the flowering made this a part of the reason why we had a good crop. But at the end of June, we had some rain, which is very good. Because otherwise, you could see some young vineyards started to suffer a little bit with the heat. And again, end of July, second wave of heat. And it was the same thing. Vineyards were healthy, no problem with disease, but I was anxious with this second wave of heat. But again, like we had some rain, storm who came. Storm means rains, no hail, which is is the pressure when you've got a lot of this heat. Sometimes you can have a pressure with hail, but no hail, just water. Calm down in August, and the third wave of heat came, but this one we did not expect. So 23 is not early picking vintage. We started, I think, the 2nd or the 3rd of September. Compared to other warm vintage, is not that early. Personally, I still believe it's because it was a big crop. So we need to get the grape mature. But this third wave affect the harvest condition. It means after 30 years, I never had in my memory this condition during harvest. It was very, very hot. It means despite the reflection about the winemaking, I had to manage some other questions where normally I don't need to have to manage. It means to manage the team because everything is handpicked. So we had to manage to make sure all pickers are healthy and in good shape to do the job. So it means you have to pick earlier in the morning, just the sunrise. And we did less hours per day. Sometimes we did not pick any grape in the afternoon. Yes, to protect the pickers. And I didn't want to have my grapes in the press too warm. So it means you have to anticipate. It means, as I said, 23 was a big crop. So I had to hire more people because the days will be shorter in time of picking. It takes more long to pick to cover the domain. So we hire more people, did less hours per day to preserve the condition, and happy with the result.
Do you feel that recent climate change is reshaping the concept of terroir?
Yeah, but in different aspects. Like for example, we do some red. And in Chassagne, the maturity for the standard Chassagne Village Rouge, when I started to work, was not the most easier grapes to manage because we had sometimes issue to add a good maturity. Now, with the evolution of the climate, we don't have enough. We don't have any more problem to get the grapes ripe. And sometimes you have to avoid to wait too long, otherwise you get too much sugar and too much alcohol. So it's a big difference. I would say that maybe today the less sought after appellation in Burgundy, especially what was done in the 70s and the 80s, has got much more potential of maturity because of the global warming. Yeah. You know, I'm talking like appellation like Chassagne-Montrachet, Chantonnay, Marange, Saint-Aubin Rouge, or Cédurès, Montely. And in some area, some vintage, it is the opposite, meaning you can keep the freshness in some cooler part. And the other reflection will be like young vineyards. Young vineyards in a top terroir of Burgundy. The top terroir are what? They are located most of the time in the coteaux, where the soil is more poor, where there is less water because there is less humidity, so less pressure with disease, the better exposure. The exposure makes wine better because the sun is there. But when you've got young vineyards, in a sunny vintage, those top vineyards can be in trouble sometimes to get too much sun, especially the young vineyard. You can see some drought, you know. So this is a way to explain, you have to manage sometimes differently the wine growing to, I don't want to say to fight, but you have to adapt questions with problems.
What does wine mean to you?
What a wine means to me. Not to make it basic, but it's a drink.
Okay.
And a wine, at one point, has to be drunk. And not only tasted.
Okay.
And this is very important. All our business and life, I have to be honest, we give pleasure to people. That's it. As I like to say, for the common people, first of all, they pay their house, their car, the costs of the life, the children, and if something is there is a little bit of money left, okay, pleasure, wine. And we are at the end. Okay, the evolution of the wine business, wine marketing, can see some very expensive wine on the market all over the world, but at the end of the story, the bottle needs to be drunk. And it's not only a product to sell, because when the bottle is open, the value of the bottle is gone.
You were born into a family deeply connected to wine. However, not everyone who grew up in Burgundy choose wine as profession. Was there a particular moment when you seriously decide to pursue wine as your career?
Good question, but personally, I didn't think too much to do something different. But I have to make it clear, not because it was an easy decision. If you start to think, okay, let's do it because it's in the family, and I think it's not a good way to start to think, because it's not an easy job.
No, right.
Physically, work in the vineyard every day by any types of weather. Cold in the winter, can be super warm during summer. So it's not only for pleasure. And after, you have to make a decision where you want to go. If you want to grow this vineyard to sell your grapes, or if you want to grow this vineyard to make grapes and make wine with and sell it in bottle under your name. You need to like wine. And it's not because you grew up in a wine business, you like wine. You need to like. You need to compare. You need to be, for my opinion, open-minded. Yeah. And 30 years ago, after the wine studies, I decided to work overseas, in Australia, in New Zealand, to discover other horizons. different grapes, different philosophy, different approach, learn English. It's good to be open-minded. Okay, Burgundy is famous, but there is good wine everywhere. And to make sure you try to do your best for the wine, it's very important to taste a lot of different wine and sometimes visit other winery or region to understand.
If you had not become a winemaker, what profession do you think you might have chosen?
If I had the good level,
Yeah.
I would love to be a tennis player,
Oh.
but I wasn't good enough. I was decent, but
Yeah.
not to be professional.
Tennis. Actually, when I was young, I played tennis. I like tennis.
Next time.
Next time, tennis, golf. Yeah.
Golf, yeah.
Okay, tennis player. John McEnroe, Andre Agassi. Which player do you like it?
Agassi.
Ah,
Yes, I'm the generation with Agassi.
Ah.
Yes, because it changed the way to play the tennis to not the previous generation play super long, blah, 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 and
Yeah.
and Agassi when came he was pushing fast and push hard. Yes, I like this.
It's like almost 30 years ago,
Oui?
right? Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
Okay. Winemakers often describe each vintage as being like a child to them. Is there any particular vintage that remain especially memorable to you?
For whites, I always repeat the same vintage because 2007.
Ah, 2007.
I like this one very much. I told I like freshness into the wine, and in warm vintages I always avoid to pick too late.
Okay.
2007, it was completely the opposite. We should pick early, not because of the summer, just because of the super early spring.
Okay.
The vineyard started to grow super early, and the flowering was done super early, and we look at the calendar and we say, oh, okay, we are going to pick end of August, first week of the first September. Summer came, not good weather during the summer. So we didn't have this sugar rising race, and it came slowly. And in 2007, we were one of the last to start to pick.
Okay.
We took a risk because the forecast was good for 3 weeks. And we started, I think, around the 9th, the 10th of September.
Oh.
And the result was healthy grape, ripe, good acid, vibrant wines. I don't want to say sharp, but lean. And today is pretty much the vintage I like to open. The problem is with this vintage, sometimes it can be underestimated because some 07 can be sometimes only acid with a little bit of dilution. But when you find a good bottle of 2007, if I can make this style of vintage more often, I will sign.
Okay. What wines do you personally enjoy drinking? Are there any producer would you recommend?
In Burgundy, a friend of mine, Jérémy says from Domaine du Jacques. It's because of Domaine du Jacques I'm using wall cluster in my Chassagne. My grandfather, my father used to distem 100%.
Okay.
Me, my first winemaking for reds, I push more the extraction, and I say no, it's not a good direction. So I'm using wall cluster in my red production since the vintage 2009. And at that time in Chassagne-Montrachet, we were not allowed to use a wall cluster.
Oh.
So it changed my reds. My dad always, and even my grandfather, always made good reds. They age very well. But since we are doing wall cluster, the good thing is I get people interested for Chassagne Rouge or even Chassagne Premier Cru Rouge, because the flavor I can get from this winemaking interesting a bit more people. Before, I had a lot of clients who came to us for whites, and reds were less interested. And now I would say it's got equal. Yes. So yes, because with many talking with Jeremy about the world cluster, I'd like to see the winemaking during harvest at their place, to smell vats during fermentation. And yes, is Jeremy, thank you. Yeah.
Okay. What, in your view, is the true essence of terroir?
I think it's a good discussion. This is a good question, but it's a large, because I think each vineyard all over the world has got its own terroir. What is a terroir? Well, it's a combination between the soil, the exposure, the characteristic of each region, but you cannot avoid the influence of the men. The men in the vineyard, for vineyard management decision, and of course winemaking. So there is a terroir. I like to say always, you cannot go against a terroir, but you can guide the terroir a bit where you want to go. Okay, when you make Chardonnay, you make Chardonnay. When you make Pinot, it's Pinot. But if you look for more freshness for white and elegance for Pinot, you will manage your vineyards or terroir and your winemaking. It's not the same direction if you want to have a more rich and generous Chardonnay or more extracted Pinot Noir to make darker wine. So terroir is important, and in my way to make the wine, I want to leave the terroir talk itself. So of course I've got my vision of winemaking, but I want to make sure the wine is different because the vineyard is growing in a different area, not because I am doing something different.
Okay. Even today, there are aspects of winemaking that you still find challenging or intimidating?
This is the difference between when I started 30 years ago and now. I have to say, since the vintage 2015, so 10 years, I think I started harvest 7 times in August. So this is a reality. So, okay, with years and years of experience, you know your vineyards, you know how to react. But now you have to make new decisions. So in fact, I assume it's each generation has got its own problem. And our problem, from my point of view, is, again, to keep freshness. And winemaking needs to be adapted with this vision. And I have to say it's becoming more and more difficult to keep this style because of the evolution of the climate. And the window to make wine like that is becoming narrow and narrow. It means you have to adapt, you have to react, you have your staff and your team ready to go. Otherwise, you will get more climate vintages. There is one thing we don't control, is the climate,
Okay, beginning with the 2021 vintage, you release wines under your own name for the first time. How did that feel?